Hello, welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. We pick either a new release film on streaming. We might do movie theaters when they come back, right? Which may be never. But yeah, so it's a new movie, either new to streaming or just new in general. What do we have this week for Film Trace?
We are delving into newish film territory. Technically, this movie did get a abbreviated theatrical release back in the early part of 2020. Was it released like the first weekend of March, I believe?
It was right when the pandemic was taking off. Yeah.
Yes. And I think, it was the second weekend of March was like the last official death knell of the box office. And the movie is First Cow from auteur Kelly Reichardt. She is best known probably for the movie Wendy and Lucy, starring Michelle Williams, and her dog that goes missing. But she has had a pretty healthy career carving out this niche role as a quiet, slowcore filmmaker. And slow cinema, as it's been dubbed, has had a lot of kind of ups and downs, similar to, I would imagine, the trajectory of the mumblecore genre back in the 2000s. But it's Kelly Reichardt's keeping that train going, and she perhaps got highest profile when her debut movie Old Joy became inductee to the Criterion Collection. So this is her new film that, exactly as the title implies, follows not the first cow president, but the first cow that appeared in small town Oregon in the 1820s, I believe was the
1820s,
decade. Yeah. And I mean that's pretty much it. You've got two main characters that both are invested in using this cow's milk to pursue their dream of opening a bakery or restaurant in its kind of untamed territory, right? And the lead actors are Joe Magaro and Orion Lee. Toby Jones also has a key supporting role. It is another A24 film, and yet it goes against most of what A24 has been known for.
Wait, what do you mean by that? What does it go against? I want to know. Because we should preface this that we chose this film. Well, partly chose it because we're both big A24 fans. Like, I love pretty much anything they put out, I will watch because it has the A24 label on it. Now, again, they don't produce the films. Most often they just distribute them, right. But they have a really keen eye for great artists. And why do you but A24 does kind of have a house style, right? It's usually it's hard to describe. It's like, cinematography is super important in most of their films. Mm-hmm. They're very flashy in the sense, in an artistic sense. So a lot of like film Twitter people latch onto them. The Lighthouse. I mean, you could go down the list of the ones that they've released and you're going to recognize the look right away. Yes. Uncut Gems, Ladybird, Moonlight, Ex Machina, Midsummer, The Witch. They all sort of have this very vibrant sort of look to them. So how do you think First Cow kind of plays against that sort of trope that they've set up, or house style?
Well, I mean, it's right there in the director's name. I mean, Kelly Reichardt is no spring chicken, and she's no kind of incendiary new voice in the medium. She's been around for a while, right? Old Joy came out back in, was it 09, 06? And
yeah,
so
06.
Yeah, and even before that, she was known for doing short films. She's a kind of controversial instructor over at Bard College. and there's some fun Rate My Professor reviews of her on there. And I mean, it's just like she is very confident in what she does, and she does not do flashbang, like edgy material. She does very stately and quiet filmmaking.
Yes.
And it's not everyone's cup of tea. It's not, I mean, in one, so let's start with the conception of this, right? We've got the basics down. Let's do the trace. Okay.
Yeah.
So this movie originated actually from a novel. This is the first movie I believe we're doing that's an official adaptation of another work. For this podcast. And so she has a long-term collaborator, John Raymond, who wrote Night Moves, which was first I should just make sure that Dan, you and I are on the same page. Have you seen any of her movies besides this one and Wendy and Lucy?
I have not. Night Moves is high on my list, though.
Okay, yes. So Night Moves, which probably was her biggest profile one, if only because it had a trio of big name actors, Dakota Fanning, Jesse Eisenberg, and Peter Sarsgaard in the lead roles as eco-terrorists. And that sounds flashy, but it's not. It's very slow moving. Like her other movies, Michelle Williams was her main acting collaborator for Wendy and Lucy, and the only other Western she made besides First Cow, if you would call it a Western, Meek's Cutoff back in 2010. But John Raymond worked with her specifically on kind of some of these bigger ones. He wrote Old Joy, he collaborated on Wendy and Lucy and Meek's Cutoff, and then he wrote Night Moves. And so then this movie, First Cow, is adapted from his novel called The Half-Life. And so it's the first movie probably from the Kelly Reichardt series that had a life of its own before she conceived it with John Raymond. And even then it went through a big change, right? Like this was a novel that was written in 4 parts that took place over the course of several years. And Reichardt knows that like when she needs to make a movie, she's going to make it small. And I respect that about her greatly. I don't think this movie would have worked at all, or perhaps in your view, it would have been even worse if it had tried to, do the chronicling thing. I think that so rarely works in movies where they try to speed through decades of the lives of the characters. And instead we're just focusing on one moment.
And she sort of refuses to do that because in like a lot of the interviews about this, how this movie came to be, she had read this novel even before she made Old Joy and had loved it so much but could not figure out a way in to that longer narrative. And she even told Jonathan to hold the novel, that she wanted to do it eventually. And I think they just kept working on it. And then eventually they came across, they called the script First Cow. There was no cow in the novelization at all.
Right.
And in one interview, we're just getting asked a question about the crowd. He's, how did you come up with this cow motif in the film? And she didn't recall. And she just couldn't remember why there was a cow in it. And I thought that was very fascinating because, it's called First Cow. It takes center stage on some of the marketing for the most part. But when you get into the film itself, it's definitely about these two men and their sort of newly formed bond and friendship. And sure, the cow is there and it's an important plot point, but it's not really kind of as in your face as I think the A24 marketing made it to be.
Right.
And I think I just thought that was an interesting sort of play on it. A24 is actually pretty infamous for, I would call it maybe radical or guerrilla marketing, where they take an aspect of a movie or a plot and push it out front. And that's not actually what the movie's about. The sort of paradigm of that would be It Comes at Night, which they marketed as an apocalyptic sort of horror film.
Right.
That it had some sort of supernatural or monster element. And of course, if you've seen it, there is none. And so that got a cinema score of a D+. I think people know Kelly, and I think they know what her films are about. So there probably was a little bit less of that with the crowd that went to go see it. But there definitely was this sort of like iconography of the cow that's not really in the movie at all. And I thought that was interesting. And, you can tell that the story is way broader. And there's a lot more narrative tentacles out there within the film itself that we only hear a little bit, like going to China and starting this business and sort of their past and being on the run. But we only really get about a week of their lives, I think, right? Like, how long does this movie take place over? Besides the prologue, of course,
right,
which is in present day, which I thought was a really interesting way to open the film, where you essentially, and I think I'm reading this right, and spoilers, of course, but it's the first 2 minutes of the movie. A young woman walking a dog. Is that her old dog, Lucy? Maybe.
I don't know.
It could be. Comes across some bones of two men holding hands, right? And then it kicks you off into the past in the story. And And I thought, like, I'm assuming that that's them, right? Is that the right assumption that I'm making?
Yes, and that's an interesting way to kind of go a little deeper into this story, because I think that once again, spoiler alert for anybody that is for whatever reason listening to this and still interested in seeing First Cow, because I do think that when I saw that opening, I automatically thought, like, this is strange for Kelly Reichardt to choose a frame story, because I assumed that that's what they were going for. But then when we never returned to the present by the end of the film, but the framing, cinematography, the graceful kind of ending, even if abrupt, that it comes to at the end, everything clicks together. Especially, and I think the probably third most important shot, aside from the bones laying there in present day, and then the two main characters laying there at the end of the film, is a shot that's just prior to that. It's a shot of the young man who earlier in the film gets cut in line to get a donut that the characters have made with the cow's milk, and these are oily cakes, as they call them, that are just it shoots off their popularity. But then, of course, everything goes wrong, and they're on the run, and we find out that this kid, this like maybe 16-year-old kid, that really wanted an oily cake and never got one, ends up being the last one that is still, trying to hunt them at the end of the film. And so it's very telling that, like, she does this so elegantly and yet so firmly as well. One review that I read, I believe it was Allison Shoemaker from RogerEbert.com, put it well, where we typically get either as far as indie cinema goes, the very open-ended kind of aloof ending that can be, both profound but also very admittedly frustrating in many ways. And you could read it that way, but then you could also read it as very definitive, as kind of you read it, where it's like, obviously that's who our two guys are, and that's exactly how they died, is that final shot of them resting in the woods after one of them had been already injured and another one doesn't know where to go, and they feel like they're basically just running out the clock. But the genius of Kelly Reichardt is that she lets you have your cake and eat it too. You can have it as the open-ended ending or as the definitive one.
She does do that well.
Yes.
I will give her that. From an indie perspective, it's definitely it feels very indie, but there is this polish to this. And I think that's just because of her experience from doing this for so long. Mm-hmm. And she has a confidence as a filmmaker to really do it in exactly the way she wants to. She's not leaning back on some genre or some sort of archetype of an indie film or anything like that. She's really doing exactly what she wants to do in her own voice. And I think that's one example of that. And another thing too about this film, just thinking about like how it came to be, and sort of going into the production side of things, she had this novel as a source to work with, and she obviously picked and choose what she wanted to use from that. But she also really had this very clear vision of a Western film. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, that's the genre that you would probably place this in, but it's a completely non-traditional Western. One, it's in the middle of the dense, almost rainforest-like forests around Portland, Oregon. So it doesn't have that deserty sagebrush feel to it at all. It's very claustrophobic as opposed to the desert, which is very wide open.
Right.
She infuses this sort of stuff, I think, way before she even was shooting. Like, she has this method, I think, when making a film, where she just has this almost buffet of ideas, a smorgasbord of like concepts that she brings to the film. Even choosing the 1820s, like she talked about how in the 1840s, when Meek's Cutoff takes place, there's photography that she can look at. There's sort of examples and images she can look at. 1820s Oregon, there aren't any. And she specifically chose that as a sort of more gray area to work in. And just being in Portland, in Oregon, how many like Western films take place in Oregon during this time?
No.
I mean, can you name another one? Like, exactly. No. So she's definitely, she's unique in terms of what she's choosing to adapt here, but also her vision that she brings to it is 100% her own, which is exactly, kind of what you think you're going to get with an indie filmmaker. But I think it's rare to see somebody this confident and this skilled in doing just that pre-production conception side of things. That's the thing that really blew me away, especially not just watching it. You can tell it feels like a very well researched and meticulous period piece.
Yes.
But also when talking about the film and the actors and what they went through to do this was not a small endeavor. You know, we call it a small film or whatever and an indie film, but this kind of felt like almost a bigger version of that. And, you know, one thing we didn't mention is sort of the budget on something like this.
Yes.
So her other films, I think Meek's cut off her creative. What was the other one? Certain Woman. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Certain Woman. She said specifically in an interview, she didn't state what the budget was for this film, but she said essentially that I can't physically make a movie for that budget anymore. Mm-hmm. And that budget was $2 million. And she basically went on to talk about the shooting schedule for this one versus another film. This is the first time she's ever done a 5-day week shoot. So they basically did 30 days of shooting, but only 5 days per week. So a little bit more relaxed, not shooting 7 days a week. But you're thinking about what's the budget for something like this? If it's not $2 million, what do you think it would be? Like if you had to guess.
I mean, I mean, just based on what you would take to recreate an era like this, there's no way it can be any less than 1 million, right? I mean, this is really, I don't know. I mean, the biggest name is Toby Jones, so he couldn't have cost that much.
No, yeah.
But
and the other people involved are, you know, they're phenomenal journeyman actors to some degree, but like not big names that are gonna have a big pull.
Yeah. And
I think in A24 probably, I don't know when A24 got involved either. Like if they were involved early, I'm sure they gave them a lot of extra cash to sort of finish this thing off, but they had to have that up front to even think about doing this shoot in Oregon. So and the reason I bring that up is that the film does have this sort of, like you said, it walks this fine line between indie and maybe a more established adult drama from a major studio. Like there's aspects of it that are there, mm-hmm. but there's always that melodrama that you would get in, say, a focus feature movie that was shot for $30 million. Those are all sort of sanded off, right, and sort of sculpted off more likely, and to give you a little bit more of an interesting and rich layered sort of film. I never once did I say to myself, well, this is like maudlin or too much. Like right. that vocabulary doesn't come into play with her.
No.
But at the same time, it has that intricacy as well. So I think that's one of the things that really stuck out to me when she was sort of talking about this film overall.
Yeah. And one thing to consider perhaps that your parallel to focus features is making me think is like, so much of those focus features period dramas are focused on the elite, the intellectual, the wealthy, right? The noble and royalty. And so, yes, of course, recreating all of that is going to take some real cash. And one thing that's beautiful about what Reichardt's done with First Cow is that not only is she going for something way smaller, but then even when you think in terms of Westerns, like modern day Westerns are still just like so recycled, and that they even were back in the golden era of Hollywood. They were so recycled that it was, you know, an over reliance on the archetypes. And so she's like building new archetypes here about like the Oregon Trail. Cause like when we think about the Oregon Trail, which is ironically what Meek's Cutoff is about, we think about, you know, like you said, like the vast deserts and all that. And so then you think about like the, you know, reconstructing the wagons and all the extras that are involved with something like that. But here you've got like the destination. Like I definitely thought while I was watching this film, like, all those years of my youth playing Oregon Trail, I never actually thought like what Oregon looked like when they got there. And she's finally giving this to us, and also doing it in a way where it's like it's believable, and also it's the everyday people. Like you've got like trappers, and like the main character is a cook, another main character is an Asian immigrant on the run from a fugitive from Russian immigrants. It's such a gap filling trajectory that she's going for here, and because there's so little available to create it, she comes up with it on her own through that, you know, hardcore research and through the elegant cinematography. I also think that, speaking back on your point on trying to make this, you know, walk that fine line between the stately focus features film and the kind of rough and tumble, small micro budget indie movie, is her obsession with the 4:3 aspect ratio Like,
yes, yeah.
this is something that it really took me a minute. I remember seeing Wendy and Lucy and Meek's Cutoff in theater, and especially Meek's Cutoff when you're literally like watching the wide open terrain of the Oregon Trail and thinking like, I wish this was wider. But she purposely like pulls back on that, and she's like, no, think smaller. This is about the people. This is not about the landscape. And I think it's beautiful when you can get past it.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because she said that in some interview that this is a Western, but there's going to be no Western shots. Mm-hmm. So there's no shots just of the landscape for itself, right? Which she went out of her way to do that. And so she's definitely, has her very sort of unique, specific voice that she wanted to bring to this. She also said that, we call this a Western, and obviously it's sort of unique environment, but it's less a sort of moving from east to west and more of sort of far east to west, where a lot of the influence is from Asia and Russia, as opposed to from like Pennsylvania or New York. So I think the overall sort of message there is this is really a unique conception and a unique production at the end of the day. Like, this is not a normal film that gets made on a yearly basis. Like, this is something pretty special on that level. In terms of, I think a couple other things in terms of the production, like in casting, just tidbits that they came across. John Magaro never met her in person before he showed up on set. So he basically auditioned solely through Skype and video sort of messaging apps. And sort of he sort of knew her through people. So he was a little bit connected, and he knew of her, or he knew of her, I should say. Orion Lee was totally different. So she went through hundreds of actors. And what she said essentially was that, unfortunately, a lot of actors of Asian descent get pigeonholed into certain types. And she found that she couldn't really grasp what a lot of the actors were capable of, because a lot of their roles were very sort of stereotypical Asian roles. And so she really took a long time to figure out this character. And Orion, I think, just stood out. I think he read like 4 or 5 times for her in person to really get this. So it was it's an interesting sort of, you would think that in terms of casting and finding people, it would be more like the John Magaro sort of role, or on an indie film, kind of somebody a little bit, kind of in your circle. But with Orion Lee, it was more like a traditional sort of Hollywood casting situation. So this is not an easy film to make.
No.
I think is what it comes down to. And, I think that does definitely show on the final product. The 4:3 aspect ratio, ever since, what was the movie that came out? Lighthouse. Was that Lighthouse in 4:3?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think that was one of the first movies I saw in the theater recently in 4:3, and I couldn't focus.
It's hard to shake. Yeah.
I couldn't even, there's just something about the widescreen to me that just makes it cinematic. And I think Kelly is adamant about not making things cinematic.
Right.
And I think that plays out not only through the production, but also through the writing, the characterization, and the content of the film. I think she just has a vision not only of this story, but of what filmmaking is all about and its purpose. And she hits that point over and over and over again, I think, in this film. And I think in my gut, it's kind of like you hate it or you love it. And if you do sort of like her vision, I think her film philosophy, then you're going to like love everything she's going to do, because it has those repeatable, the slow cinema genre elements in it that really tell a specific type of story. But if you're probably like me, who's kind of like, what would you call my sort of style when it comes to genre? Genre Nazi is what you call it?
Puritanical. Yeah.
Puritanical with genre. It can be very unsettling. And I would say, if you tried to show this movie to an average person who is not super into film, they would have real trouble with it.
Oh yeah.
Right from the start. And I think that speaks to something. I don't know what that speaks to exactly. But this is a film for film nerds. It's not a film for the general audience at all. Some movies can cross over. This definitely could never cross over. It just does not have those elements in there. It doesn't have that sort of language in there that would connect with an average moviegoer. Maybe it's a good time to start talking about the release. Like, how did this thing come out? How did it roll out? What was the reception?
Yeah, it was interesting because obviously not only because of the pandemic interrupting things on the traditional release side, but, Reichardt, it's interesting looking at her in the interview circuit after that whole mess and now it arriving on VOD. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, she said this. She is thankful that people are going to have a way to see it. But she has said that she's a control freak and would wish that she could, go to everybody's TV settings and make sure that it was the perfect amount of light and, motion smoothing and all that stuff. But what's probably most interesting about even before the whole rollout on VOD thing is that they were planning on having, it was desirable by a lot of film festivals, including Venice. But A24 made the decision to skip Venice and as well as Toronto. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Or definitely Venice. And I can't figure out why. Because when is Venice? August? September?
Yeah, September.
It's like it's before Toronto,
right?
And Venice would be, it's a big it's an international film festival that's pretty massive, and it kind of kicks off the fall season. I can't figure out why they wouldn't want to show it to international. Do you think it wouldn't be as palatable to European people that are going to go to the festival? What do you think?
Possibly. I also think that, Reichardt does not seem to like to play the game, so to speak. It did premiere back at Telluride, and I think that kind of she understands that if she wants people to see the movie, she's got to play the game to some degree, so she'll do whatever A24 wants. So it is more of a question of, from A24's side of things, if they had say over where they put it out. Maybe it's just a feeling of like it's a quiet film, and they say what you will about A24's house style, as mentioned earlier in the podcast, but like I think they get auteurs. Like they're also known to very much believe in the director doing what they think is best, and so it's very possible that they came to some kind of agreement where it's like, yeah, let's premiere it at the festival, get some hype, but there's no reason to send it through the circuit, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And then, when this thing did premiere, the critics adored it, right? Like you're looking at like 96% all critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, 8.3 out of 10, which is very, very high, especially that actual rating of 8.3. Top critics even higher, 97%, 9.1 out of 10. And this, sometimes with the indie films, you get like 30 reviews. No, this is 130 review average. Yeah. So beloved by critics. Audiences, not so much. 56%. But again, it's tough with the audience score here. It's probably a small sample. I forgot the sample size on this one, because not a lot of people are able to see it in the theaters because it opens up, pandemic hits pretty hard 2 weeks later. So 56% score from the audience, 66 actual score. Nonetheless, the people who did vote didn't like it. But then you look at other audience sort of barometers here. Letterboxd, which is film nerds, 4 out of 5. That's basically, I call it an 80 out of 100. Very, very high.
Yeah.
Rarely do you see a film get above 75 to 80. That's like masterpiece territory for that group of people. And then IMDb, which is your average person, 7.1 out of 10, which is actually, I thought was very high for IMDb. Yeah. Because if you related it to the RT audience score, you'd be like, that's pretty, you think like a 6.5 or something like that.
IMDb is interesting because, yes, it's full of plebes, as you might say, but it's also full, like legit full of people that watch tons of movies. And so I think they're also a highly impressionable audience. So if the critics tell them it's good, then they might that might skew their score. That is very true. And then when this thing did open March 6, 2020, going back to our Wildland roots, diving into the box office real quick, 4 theaters. I think I've always mentioned these 4 theaters: Lincoln Square, Angelica, and then ArcLight Hollywood and Landmark in LA. That's the 4 theaters that you open a super arty film on.
And you do that to get a barometer. How's this thing going to do? It did 81K opening weekend, which puts it at like a 20K per theater average. Basically, you know, if I'm like a studio exec or something like that, it does 20K per theater, and those 4 theaters, it's going nowhere. So like for something like this, it's already arty. It's already a New York, LA film. For it to break out at least 40K per theater or higher to push it out. They might have done 500 theaters nationwide, or US and Canada, but I don't see it really going above like 200 theaters, to be honest with you.
No.
And then the whole run was basically cut short, so we can't use the final total as any sort of measure of how it's doing. But I think the opening was pretty muted for an art film like this. I think the people that did see it, like the critics and the Letterboxd crew, the film Twitter people, absolutely love this film. But that's a small little bubble. I don't really see it expanding out ever. What about the critics? What about some positive and negative takes on this thing?
Yeah, it's interesting to see what this looks like, especially considering award season, because we have a long ways to go, and also the Oscars have been postponed because of the pandemic. So whether or not people remember this will come nomination time will be interesting, because it was kind of tough to find some negative reviews. Even the negative reviews kind of like, it sounded similar to what you were saying, Dan, how you personally felt, where it's like, on the one hand, this isn't for me, but on the other hand, like, there's so much to respect about it, because like, how do you really hate on something that is so meticulously well crafted and fills a hole that's basically been never filled in the history of cinema. So you have obviously the positives. David Sims of The Atlantic called it a masterwork of indie cinema, a tale that's both charming and unsparing, suffused with equal measures of wonder and dread. I would be remiss not to mention that I think, apart from the 2 central characters, the moment of the film that just like hooked me and made me fall in love with it was the big bearded guy bringing his baby to the bar and getting teased, and then just watch it for that scene alone. It's a absolutely beautiful scene. And it's a good example of what Sims says there. Anne Hornaday of the Washington Post talked about it as a jaundiced portrait of greed, racism, and nativism at its most dishonest and chauvinistic. It's so interesting how many different layers you can get from this movie, because I didn't even think about like the capitalism parable aspect of it until reading about it, because I was so focused on the characters themselves. But I mean, it's ruthless in many ways. Negative reviews, people called it protracted, with like a small rush of suspense. That's Richard Brody of The New Yorker,
who I have a weird love-hate relationship with.
Yeah, he's a weird guy, man.
He's super weird. It's like when he's on and like I love his opinion, it's like the exact opinion that no one else has. But like 80% of the time, it's sort of I hate everything he says.
Yeah, it's just like that. That's just a good example of a quote that just misunderstands the whole purpose of slow cinema.
It's a very short review. He only did a paragraph review.
Yeah. And Mick LaSalle of the San Francisco Chronicle, a very different kind of idiosyncratic.
Yes. He's more
critic.
of like, he's like he's more like a film scholar. Like, he's like an old school guy.
He's super old school. He says, well, we have a pretty good idea as to where they're going to end up at the beginning. It's like,
well, duh.
I mean, no, come on. Like the people complaining about knowing how Titanic ends. I don't know. So like I said, but even those negative quotes were hard to find. Like it's so overflowing, just absolutely phenomenal. It will be interesting to see, going back to the box office angle real quick, to see, because clearly it's a critical success, but I'm curious, Dan, what you think with this new VOD model, $14.99. Are we the only ones that paid that to watch First Cow?
We're like one of maybe 500 people that have paid to see this movie. Like, this is like, I can't imagine. Another thing about the release that really blows my mind why they didn't do Venice. It's like, if you don't do Venice, then you're not trying to go for awards. Right. Like, you can do Toronto and stuff, and maybe, but Venice is where you get that. I mean, that's how Joker won all the awards it did, because it won Venice, right? Because that was the first kickoff. So it blows my mind that they wouldn't do that. But I think A24 knew what this was. This is a sort of calling card to the art film world and film critics that we are A24. We support great artists. It was not a financial decision, whatsoever. I think it's almost like they wrote off the budget and everything with it as like a marketing cost to their studio.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, if I'm looking at this like very business-like, title sucks. The trailer's ridiculous. So I have no idea what it's about. And the film itself is basically unmarketable and no one would see it. And if they did see it, they'd give it an F cinema score. Like if you release this to 2,000 people, I would say at most a D plus cinema score. Like there's no. And like, was there the intention there? I mean, she says herself, she never makes any money from her movies. This is sort of, this is a passion for her. This is a calling. This is what she wants to do and has done with her life. And you can kind of see that in the film, but it's not in any way a marketable product for a group outside of like huge cities and art film people. Like it's just not there. And I think that for me, and one of the reasons I also hated Wendy and Lucy, is that for some reason, I love auteurs. I love people that take chances, but like, to me, there's almost like a disrespect for the basic elements of storytelling here that are like, and it's done on purpose. Yeah. To basically be like, oh, I don't need to do these things because either I'm too good for that or no one needs to do them. But there's sort of a pompousness to the entire film and the look of it where you're sort of like, yeah, you're an amazing artist and you've surrounded yourself with great people. But you're telling a story at the end of the day. You're making a movie. And there's sort of like, I don't know. It felt very, I'm trying to think like what would be the parallel to this in maybe like a different art form, like music per se.
Yeah. I mean, it's ambient music, right?
It would be like, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of, remember when the Liars put out that album? Concept album about witches, yes. Which I love because, and this is another thing too about the medium with film, you know, I'm very much into genre work, like very, very good polished stuff. And I'm a little bit less into the experimental stuff, but with music, I'm the exact opposite. But I could see that if I put on that Liars record to an average person, they might punch me in the face. Right. Like, so it kind of has that punch me in the face element to it. Where it's so affected. And I mean, on the very basis of the entire film and every scene, it's so affected that I think for someone like me, it kind of rubs me the wrong way. And I think that would be a little bit more indicative of what the general audience would find. I
also think it'd be a good idea to mention the fact that this is, and this is only tangentially related to what you're talking about, but it did make me think of it, that this is the first Reichardt movie we're getting post Me Too. Basically, Me Too was on the rise when certain women came out, and there's lots of parallels there. I recommend all of Reichardt's work, obviously. I'm a fanboy. But I definitely recommend certain women, and to look at that as a parallel to this, which is a movie that has little to no female characters, and yet because she already did that with Meek's Cutoff, looking at it from the women's point of view on the Oregon Trail. But here she's looking at male characters in such an unmasculine way, in an inherently masculine genre. And like, it's so, I think that was enough to get me really thinking and reckoning with, you know, what our basest impulses are when we consume cinema. And that's enough to like say like, this is worthwhile. Not only is this worthwhile, but like I get joy watching it. Like the bearded guy with the baby in the bar. It's like, I saw myself. And anytime you see yourself in movies, that's when, you know, everything clicks. And there's going to be collateral damage. There's going to be people that see this.
Absolutely, man.
and just hate it.
The only way you can make great art is by pissing people off. I mean, that's the rule. Like,
right.
You can't do anything great unless you do that. All right. That's First Cow. What an interesting movie. And I hope you guys do check it out. It's absolutely worth seeing because it is a very rich, layered film that is not like anything else you're going to see this year. And you're home alone, not doing anything. So spend the $14 and support an independent artist.
Absolutely.
What do we got coming next week?
we are going to head back into the time machine, so to speak, to look at a movie newly available to streaming this month. A movie that means something, maybe, but perhaps means nothing. It's a little movie called Pineapple Express by David Gordon Green.
It's going to be awesome. Thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.